Well, first of all, welcome everyone. We are thrilled to finally have this roundtable on the collaboration for equal access to higher education by having an exchange with students on this very pressing matter. Just a few words on the conference structure. It is recorded and also the chat will be very active throughout the roundtable. So please do not hesitate to comment, ask questions on in the chat throughout the roundtable. And at the end, we will share everything with you, everything that would have been mentioned or shared by the speakers, and also the recording of this roundtable. Let me maybe, first of all, introduce in a few words the speakers. And after that, we will talk a little bit more about the clinic's work. So we have Hélène Dixon from New Zealand. We also have Hector Lua from Honduras and Larissa Rosales Lopez from Mexico, who is also representing the French clinic. And actually, this is the 5th year of the Sciences Po Law Clinic. So we are all students and we are partnering with the Right to Education initiative. And it has been a long ride because we focused on monitoring inequalities in access to higher education in France. And there's also another team who's working right now on the report to be presented before the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And you can see in the chat our lovely Faye, who is our chat keeper. she just started to share. In the clinic, you have Faye, you also have Larissa, who's one of the speakers, Celine, who's attending, and also Chrisla and myself, Yelis Inji. The purpose of this roundtable is really to have an exchange among students on the matter of higher education and access to higher education. We are here to share insights and stories and inspire one another, and having all of this put out there. So we are really looking forward to collaborate with one another, because our ultimate goal is in the end to achieve equal access to higher education in France, but everywhere as well. We are co-hosting this roundtable with the Right to Education Initiative and Global Student Forum, and I will invite Delphine from the Right to Education to introduce the organization. Let's go, Delphine.
Yes, sorry, I was mute. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone, depending where you are part in the world at the moment. And it's like this is a very global event. So I'm Delphine Dorsey. I'm the director of the Right to Education, an international human rights organization focusing on the promotion and defense of the right to education. And as she said, like we've been working now for 5 years with students and the Sciences Po Law Clinic in Paris. It's almost, I think, 20 students that have been part of this project on monitoring inequalities in higher education in France. It's have been a learning and enriching journey, which I've come up with a concrete impact. This topic have been brought to Academia Forum, to World Conference last year in the UNESCO World Conference on Higher Education, and with some concrete discussion with policymakers in France. And as we said, like this is going to be brought to the UN for the review of France this year. And thanks to the amazing work of the students done over the past year, us at the Right to Education Initiative, we have developed a monitoring guide on how to monitor inequalities in access and participation in higher education, which is now available in English and should be soon available in French and Spanish. And we do hope this will help and be useful for other students to monitor this issue from a human rights perspective across the world. And we'll share the link during the events. We are just finalizing some pictures there, but we should have it ready for you to share today. And I'm really glad to see like these events today with this discussion opening beyond France and to have a sharing experience with students from different parts of the world and discuss how we can advance the realization of higher education, how we can contribute for better recognition. And I do hope this will also lead for a better claim of the right to higher education worldwide, and we know how this is a constant issue and a struggle and a claim to have. And I see there are some our colleagues on the call today that brought some issue, for instance, from Kenya last week. So, I mean, I hope like even the participants in the discussion today, like in the roundtable online, will bring their own expertise as well. And I wish all rich and fruitful discussion. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for everyone that have been involved in the preparation of this event, and especially the students.
Thank you so much, Delphine. And yes, a big shout out also to our tutors, Meg and Isham, who are attending, and our co-host, Global Student Forum with Frederike. If you can introduce GSF, please.
Yes, thank you so much. And again, just echoing, thank you for being here. Thank you for the amazing work that you have put into making this happen. I'm really excited to be here and excited to be a part of this. My name is Frederike. I'm based in Copenhagen, Denmark. I am Policy and Advocacy Advisor in the Global Student Forum, and I have had the privilege to lead this partnership in collaboration with the students or facilitators. The Global Student Forum is the global umbrella organization representing and advocating students' rights and interests in decision-making processes related to students' educational realities and basic life circumstances. Student rights and interests are overlapping, as I'm sure we will see. And the Global Student Forum are here to ensure that students are being heard and are being present in decisions that affect our lives. I think it's important to note that students are already leading change, as we already see. Students are well organized from educational institutional level to national level to regional level, and with the emergence of the Global Student Forum in 2020, we are now also organized at a global level. So students have been present for as long as we have had universities. Students have organized for just as long. So the Global Student Forum is just the final top, trying to extract and collect and gather all of the voices of students in most corners of the world. The Global Student Forum was founded in 2020 by the 5 largest student organizations: All African Students Union, OCLAE from Latin America, the Commonwealth Student Association, OBESO representing school students of Europe, European Student Union, and several of national unions in all parts of the world, to create a collaborative platform to ensure that students are present where necessary. Today, we represent about 202 national unions from around 102 countries. And we are so lucky to have 2 of our colleagues in the panel, so I'm sure they will say much more about what we do and how we are present. And in general, I'm just really excited to hear what the panelists have to say. I hope people will participate in the chat to gain all of the insights that I'm sure is already present in this room. And then I'm just, once again, thank you for making this happen and for all the work that you have put into this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are also very thankful for you and GSF. I suggest we should move to our first round of interventions. I would like to ask the speakers to introduce themselves and to tell us what motivates them to be engaged in the right to education. And as Faye has already put in the chat, we also want all of the people who are attending to present themselves, tell us a little bit more about themselves, what motivates them, etc. So maybe Hélène, you could start, because I know it's really early also So you have the priority.
Thank you kindly, Elis. Kia ora koutou, ko Alan Dixon toku ingoa. That is the Indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is greetings to you. My name is Ellen. I am a steering committee member from the Global Student Forum, and it was really lovely to see my colleague Federica give a bit of an introduction. And you'll also see my other colleague Hector in a moment. I'm also the National President of the New Zealand Union of Students Associations. And may I start off by saying it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited to see the amazing work that Science Po and the Right to Education initiative has put forward in this space. This is an area of passion for so many of us, which is why we're here, the right to education. It is such an essential human right. I like to think that education is the underlying factor of all other elements in human society. You have less poverty, you have less issues of climate change concerns when you have education. My background has largely been working with student unions since 2017 at the local, national, regional and global level, now at the global level as well. It's interesting, but fantastic emergence we're seeing of like the political engagement of students across so many different spaces in a very old movement, which is super cool. One of the things that I engaged with when I first started out was working with truants, or young people who are out of school, particularly gang affiliated young people in education. I come from a long line of teachers, so our philosophy is that we want to support young people who are in difficult sort of circumstances with education. So that's quite a central tenet of why we do the work that we do. And it just eventually walked me all the way to where I am here today. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I will send it back over to you, Yelis.
Thank you so much, Helen. I think now maybe your colleague Hector could take the floor.
Thank you, Elise. And I also echo thanks to everyone that has made this roundtable possible. My name is Hector Ulloa. I am a steering committee member in the Global Student Forum. But I'm not a student representative. I'm representing the associate members of that in the forum, and that is student-led organizations from all around the world. And that is because I'm currently based in Norway, where I work with the I'm the president for the Norwegian Students and Academics International Assistance Fund, and that's a development aid organization that works with topics related to academic freedom and access to higher education. So I've been doing that for 3 years now, and my background also comes, I think, from my family of teachers, my parents, my grandparents. I feel like many of the people engaged in this topic have a common story or somehow related. But back in Honduras, so I was involved also in the student movement there. I was a student representative at the national level, and then I've been engaged with human rights activism. So what motivates me, or kind of my entrance in the right to education, has always been very connected to the broader kind of role that education has in society. So very much connected with democracy and other human rights activism. So how we use education also to foster good citizenship and activism and bring societal change. And that comes from my study time, where I was exposed to student activism and all what in Latin America is quite popular, what you call the pedagogy of liberation, and how we can use education to actually change our societies. So not viewing education as a goal by itself, but as a tool for individuals to then bring the changes that we need. And I'll be speaking more about some of the changes that we need in today's world, but kind of that's my framing. It's always trying to connect education with bigger societal problems and the responsibility that students and academics and professors have when we are taking our educational journey in our societies.
Thank you so much, Hector. And I think, we will have the chance to touch upon all of those pressing issues and how education and how we build society in itself is, in the end, connected throughout the roundtable. Larissa, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Elise. I'm Larissa. I am from Mexico. I studied international relations there, and right now I am based in France because I am studying Master in Human Rights and Humanitarian Action in Sciences Po. And that is why I'm part of the Sciences Po Law Clinic in partnership with the Right to Education Initiative that Delphine has already introduced. And later on, I can explain more on what exactly are we doing in the clinic. Also, Yelisa's already introduced it, but I can go more in depth in those topics. But to answer the question about what motivates me to be engaged in the right to education, right now in France, it's just like me as a foreign student, of course, that I am, like we have this idea about like the global north having everything in check when it comes to the right to education and other type of rights, but like coming here and realizing that of course that there is certain nuances and still discrimination and qualities. Me as a foreign student, I think that it's like very important to be engaged in these issues, because like you cannot take for granted that I have the privilege to study a master in France, but that is not common for everyone, not even the people that already live in France. So like that's what got me inspired to be part of the Sciences Po Clinic. But my engagement with the right to education goes back to Mexico, not really linked to higher education, but more elementary education. I was part of an organization that advocated for the right to education for children in marginalized communities, and also connected to higher education, but not really to equal access, but more like to the quality of education and also access, but more in the sense of physical access. Was that in my university there was a problem, very complex and very specific, and that it sounds like science fiction, but there was a very corrupt government in my state, that is Puebla, and so they captured the campus and we couldn't go in. And so we mobilized and we advocated against these issues that were happening. And so I was very active in that movement. And also in my university, once that we got our university back, I was part of the student council, and I personally was very engaged with everything that had to do with gender studies and sexual gender-based violence. And so I advocated for the university to adopt a protocol. And so, that's my background, and I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to answering any other question that arises. Thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you, Larissa. Well, I think it's time for our first question. So what advocacy strategy have you implemented to create change and move towards equal access to higher education? This will be the start of the discussion. Maybe, Ellen, you could start?
It's a very good question, Yelitz, and I've been asked to talk a little bit universally as to the different elements of political action for student associations and student unions from our perspective. One of the things that stood out to me is it being an interesting topic because student advocacy strategies often appear sort of through a governmental, societal, or institutional Orwellian double spec. Excuse my literary comment there. On the one hand, student advocacy is like sometimes opposed as childishness or dissent by managerial staff or politicians when clashing with a well-accepted policy or practice, even if the system is inherently unequal. I think we can already hear a bit of that coming through from the different testimonies that we've heard from people already. On the other hand, it sometimes is like a topic to accuse Generation Me of laziness by nostalgically comparing them to the civil rights protests of the 1960s through 80s. The arguments of like strong student apathy and self-absorption employed by the sort of individualistic and capitalistic age has sort of sought to depoliticize student engagement in the classroom and wider society. Neoliberalism has attacked the demos and replaced it with atomized capitalism. These are the models often employed in higher education institutions to argue for a more consumer-based education, undermining equality. In my nation, this is the narrative currently employed to justify mass staff cuts, institutional asset sales, and the lessening of student rights. At the regional level, it's kind of employed to politically stymie the voice of young activists on campuses, sometimes through police and security presence. We've already heard about that, or to endorse cuts to national student funding. At the global level, it endorses the discrediting of student association voices as disruptive or anti-democratic, while sort of reifying our individual actors who are specifically tied often to political and financial interests of the nation states themselves. It's true that our advocacy was like once sit-ins, street protests, occupation of university buildings, or in one case at the University of Auckland in my nation, students chaining themselves in the Vice-Chancellor's office to protest fee increases. While some student associations still exercise this type of advocacy, the movement locally, nationally, regionally, and globally, having very professional-based structures in the way that we work, has trended towards sort of organizational lobbying, expert services, systems-based advocacy, and the development of wonderful things like policy tools like what you guys are doing here over the last few decades. This has occurred due to exchanges between the state and student associations where democratically elected student bodies are now seen to sort of like offer expertise or legitimize government processes for equality. But regardless of this sort of like authenticity of this exchange, one thing that I believe has remained the same is the focus on political action through relationship building. Students have always engaged in relational activism of personal, heterogeneous, and informal networks to aid in the negotiation of political power. Today, we see this with students creating coalitions, engaging in negotiations, and identifying sort of allies in political spaces for the purposes of psychologically, not just physically, occupying these spaces, not as one, but as many, to undermine the atomization that has occurred in higher education, undermining equality. This was the strategy one of the students' associations in my nation recently employed to advocate to one of our ministers when we identified at a political conference that she was trying to come to us individually to listen to one of our claims. So our diverse groups, WEAR groups, general, disabled and Indigenous associations, came to her together to demonstrate our desire for equality. The Global Student Forum is kind of another example of this, where many people from many cultures and countries come together for a collective purpose. Our advocacy strategy we implement then is actually democracy by example, an unpacking of the doublespeak by actioning the equality of access we want to the governments and institutions we seek to influence, I think. So that is my answer to your opening question there, Yelitz, and I turn back to you.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. Democracy by example, really. Hector, what about you? What kind of advocacy strategy have you been implemented or will you be implemented?
Thank you. So I think I can mention two kind of examples. One thing is about utilizing spaces, and I'll get back to this as we move forward in the panel. But it's the fact that for many years now we've had a demand from the youth sector, which oftentimes it's student representatives or student activists demanding spaces where decisions are being made. And if we look back, we're still a long way to go. But if we look at how it is now and how it was sometime before, you see that there has been some cracks in those spaces. And it's not because politicians or the decision makers have willingly just conceded space for youth, but it's because youth has really engaged with that and achieved it. And a big part of kind of the advocacy strategy, or what we want to see more of, is of people actually utilizing those spaces and bringing kind of the political content that you need to have in those discussion spaces. It's usually the youth, that has kind of, they don't have their hands tied, if you would put it in that way. They can be more critical, and they're the ones that have the bigger kind of stakes in what decisions are being made today, because we are the ones that are going to continue then seeing the consequences of those decisions. And when we talk about something like education, for example, it is a topic where you cannot see it in a short-term perspective. It always needs to be in long-term perspective, and that's why it's so important then to engage these youth and to listen to the youth and to the students and what they are kind of engaging with. So that is one thing with the advocacy. It's like we need to use the spaces that have already been open while still fighting to open all those others that are resisting to hear youth voices. And the other one I can mention is when it comes to communication, kind of how you engage the youth. And there I'll speak a little bit about the experience from SAI, the Norwegian Students and Academics International Assistance Fund, where we are recognized here in Norway for the kind of advocacy we do, because in our communicational style, if you would call it like that, we usually tend to use a lot of sarcasm or a little bit of new kind of more innovative ways of communicating, because we are working exclusively with the higher education community, and the biggest stakeholder or the biggest sector in the higher education community is students, is young people. So we need to make sure that they understand our message and that they become also advocates of our causes and our fights. And there, what we have done in these past years has always been trying to innovate in the way we communicate. There's a big difference. We work a lot with access to education and internationally. So how do you communicate the urgency and the needs of people that are not in Norway, but that we need to support them and that we need to fight and support their struggles, to someone that was born and raised in Norway and is now doing her or his master degree, and it just did the whole thing in a row. So how do you reach with that message can be challenging sometimes, because there's a big distance to understand those barriers that other people are experiencing. And there, what we have resorted to is this kind of new way of communicating. And of course, it really depends on the context and on the topics. It's not all topics that we use sarcasm or funny ways to reach youth. Sometimes we need a serious tone, and we'll also use it when it is required. But I feel like being able to engage and really analyze or understand kind of the target group that you need in your advocacy campaigns is kind of what we have demonstrated to be very efficient, and it's kind of the style that we use here in Norway. So that's kind of the one I would put forward in this question. And then what kind of topics we have used it to is something that we will keep unraveling as we go forward.
That's very interesting. And I think as students here, learning how to tailor our messages, how we communicate will be key for our personal lives, but also our advocacy careers. And also as a French person, I'm very happy that you mentioned how we need to occupy the public space. So yes, thank you, Hector. Larry, could you tell us a few words on the advocacy strategy of the clinic?
Sure. Well, about the advocacy strategy that we use in the Sciences Po clinic is monitoring. So that is doing research on whether the state, in this case France, is actually fulfilling and promoting and respecting its obligations under the, well, it can be other like national legislation or its international obligations. And so specifically, we focus on the all that concerns discrimination and inequality, because of course that when we talk about the right to education, that means a lot of things. But the Sciences Po clinic has focused specifically on the equal access to higher education. And so, as it has been mentioned before, this is an ongoing project that has that is started 5 years ago. And so, like before, like the first thing was like establishing the goals and gathering data about all these inequalities and discriminations that may exist. Specifically, the clinic has focused on inequalities based on the origin of the student or the geographic location where this person is located. And well, afterwards, of course, that you have the report, you have the information. And so the following years from 2020 to 2022, the clinic has mostly focused on the strategy of advocating through social media, through roundtables, just making all this information public out there, and also reaching stakeholders. So in some of these roundtables, there has been authorities, local authorities, but also they have reached UNESCO, and now we're trying to reach the Committee of Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. So here we see the strategy of monitoring, but also of advocating with stakeholders. And also another strategy that we use, and that is the one that we're using right now, is collaboration, capacity building, and public education. So in collaboration and capacity building, by doing this event and all the following activities that we will use based on this event, so like promoting or like sharing this event, and also some blog posts that will be like following up on what the topics that we'll be covering here. Well, by doing all these, the idea is to collaborate with other students that have the same goal than us, that of course that it's different according to the problematics that they're encountered in their own context. But we're collaborating with students that have the same goals that we have, so that we can build a stronger movement and we can create some momentum around these issues. And also specifically on capacity building, RT has this monitoring guide that Delphine has talked a little bit about it, that is going to be formally published in some days. But like the idea of this monitoring guide is to share a human rights framework for monitoring education and education related issues. And so it has very concrete steps on how to decide a goal, how to gather data, how to use specific human rights indicators to analyze that data, and also how to use that information to advocate for the right to education. And so the idea of this monitoring guide is like, if there are students that are out there in any other country, in any other context, that they know that the right to education is not being protected, promoted, or fulfilled, but they don't really have the tools to show this. So well, they can use this monitoring guide to help them, and well, to demand the state to actually fulfill and respect and promote the obligations that it has vis-a-vis the right to education. So well, those are the strategies that we've used.
Thank you so much, Letty. Before, I think I saw someone has a question in the chat. I suggest we move with but what are we talking? Okay, we will keep going with the questions for the speakers, and then we'll have a little time to answer questions in the chat. So Ellen already talked a little bit about challenges that student activists face, and I would like to have Hector and also Larry to tell us a little bit more about the biggest challenges that they may have encountered in their advocacy, and also how did you overcome it? Did you ever need to adapt your strategy throughout the way? Thank you. Hector.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So when it comes to biggest challenges, now speaking about the right to education, like I mentioned, one of the biggest things we have usually faced both in the Global Student Forum and inside is the understanding of the structural barriers that are actually limiting young people access to higher education. That is from my experience, I know that that's not something that comes across very easily, or most people don't have a good understanding, even if they support increased access to higher education, for example. But when you start discussing kind of how can you solve it, for example, a lot of people will think on increasing access to higher education is only building a school in a rural community or providing them with iPads and satellite internet, and then you'll have better access to education. But they completely ignore some of the other structural barriers that are actually holding back people's capacity to or ability to go into higher education or education at all. So how we've overcome it, what we've tried to focus on from the Global Student Forum side is on the training, capacity building, making sure that student representatives, student activists have the knowledge, understand these structural barriers, but also have the tools to be able to advocate for a change. So the first kind of challenge would be the understanding what is holding us back from achieving equal access to higher education. And then the next one is what are the solutions? What changes do we actually need to see in society in order to address those issues? And that is something that in very recent times we have tried to step up our work with doing capacity building, if you would call it, or training or schooling of student representatives on some of these structural issues. One of them is and which is unfortunately present in most countries, it's not only in developing countries that you'll find it, is economic inequality. Economic inequality as a factor that is not allowing equal access to higher education, and also lack of public funding and lack of funding for public education institutions are two of the biggest structural barriers we have for the fulfillment of the right to education. And this has also led to other kind of byproducts that we see in academia, as for example, an increased privatization of the sector, where we see more and more private actors because there's less public funding and there's a kind of solidification of this myth that public education doesn't work and you need private actors to step in order to solve it. And also when you have kind of the economic inequality aspect coming into higher education, that also means that the impact is bigger on less privileged groups. It's usually marginalized groups or historically disadvantaged groups that will see their right to education way more affected due to economic inequality. And when we look now, talking concretely about how you solve it with training or capacity building, recently what the Global Student Forum did was that we organized a program, a training program. It was 3 sessions on tax justice for education, for example. So we know that economic inequality and lack of public funding is an issue. We know that one way of addressing that is through advocating for tax justice, increasing tax revenues and investing them in education. So then what we need to do, or our goal then to change that, was let's bring together student leaders, let's bring together experts on tax justice, and let's have them discuss kind of what's the reality in their countries, what's the reality in their regions, and how can we address then these issues. And then talking about specifically about tax justice, what came out of that those sessions with student representatives from all around the world is a better understanding on these structural barriers, right? So we finished the session, and some of the things that were consolidated into the final policy paper was that student representatives have a clear, or had a clear common understanding that the global tax system, how we tax, going back to what came out of this concrete kind of session was, there's an unequal or the global tax system being still based on a very extractivist kind of relationship, where it's the global north or powerful economies that are still benefiting from tax evasion and from developing economies, and also that there were a lot of actors that were ignoring their responsibility. So you see, and if we didn't have these discussions, for example, maybe the student representative wouldn't come to the conclusion that ministers of finance in their countries need to be engaged when we talk about education. It's not only the ministers of education. You need to talk about how you're investing money. Where is the money that you're collecting going to? How can you collect this money in a better way? How can you monitor? How will you measure how that money coming from public funding is being used at schools or at universities? What kind of measurements you'll use to say, okay, this was a good investment or not. And also the last thing that came here was that there was a big misunderstanding on why do we need taxes, or why do taxes help us redistribute wealth and resources in a country, and how can those historically excluded groups be benefited? For example, if you have a better tax collection and you invest more in these groups. So you see, the main thing here, the bigger challenge was like there's a lack of understanding, and we provide this capacity building or this training. We have discussions, we just enable discussions. The knowledge is there. Sometimes what we just need is to enable those spaces, and then you have this better understanding. Now you know which actors are not present. You know that the system is unequal, so that's kind of the main thing you need to fight. And you also know that there's a misunderstanding, that knowledge that you now have, most people won't agree with you because you really need to explain it to them. And with these 3 kind of new perspectives that these people have generated, now they can start doing their own advocacy campaigns at the national level or at the regional level, because they'll know specifically who to target, what are the barriers or what are the challenges they'll face in the way, and also what are the changes they want. What is that end goal vision or that they want to see in their educational systems? So I think kind of that whole identifying the program, coming with the training, and then doing advocacy campaigns is an example I can bring on how you need to change strategies and identify challenges when advocating for the right to education.
Thank you so much, Hector. We can see once again that higher education is a highly political matter, and that it depends on so many other aspects, and tax justice is one of the main, for sure. Larissa, could you elaborate a little bit more on what are the challenges that you faced?
Sure. So, well, the challenges that we have encountered as part of the Sciences Po Clinic is like one that is very general, but I think it's very important, is that higher education is not always seen as a priority in the right to education and in general as a priority. concerning the right to education, because usually, well, of course, that to be in higher education, that means that you should have been enrolled in elementary education and secondary education. And in many countries and in many contexts, that is not a reality. But it's still like we think that higher education is a very, very relevant step and also right, because that would lead you to like, that is actually what can make an impact in like your professional experience, and also like to open your mind. Of course, that elementary and secondary education are the key of that. Like before that, like you have to have all that before going to higher education, but it doesn't finish there. Like you have to still pursue to go to university to have all this knowledge. And also when it comes to other rights that also are prioritized, and there's a reason for it, so like the right to food or the right to health, of course that you need to have all those rights in order to go to university, right? I mean, if you don't have anything to eat or you do not have a good quality of health, then you cannot really focus on the higher education. That looks more like a privilege. But we have to have in mind that actually the right to higher education is connected to all that, because once that you have a degree, then you can access better jobs, then you can be well paid, and you just have more knowledge to know like that all these other things are also your rights. And so you have more tools to advocate for those rights and to demand the state and other actors to respect those rights. So well, that is one of the challenges, that sometimes we do not have as much as attention as other partners or other colleagues who advocate for other kind of rights. And so, well, that is one issue. And also other issue that is more specific to the strategies that we have implemented, that is the monitoring or doing research, is of course, well, the problem with data. Fortunately, in the case of France, public data is reliable, and also like media is independent. So I feel that finding data is not that hard, but what is hard is finding certain data. So for example, in the case of inequalities, France does not have data on race specifically. So if you want to know if your origin or your like if you are categorized as being part of one race, if that hinders you from access to higher education, then you have to look at other things like other proxy data. So like what is your geographic location, or what is your parents' national origin, or other proxy data. And also another problem that it comes when using the strategy of monitoring or of doing research is what to do with that data, because sometimes you'll already have the data, you have analyzed it, you have published your report, but like data just like that is not really useful. You have to do something with that. So it's always a creative process of where can we publish this data, to whom should we direct it, how to make it attractive for certain public. And also another challenge that we encounter is that there are always certain variables and certain challenges that we are subject to that are out of our control. So to give a precise example on the the Sciences Clinic was planning to do last semester was to present the report to the Committee of Economic, Social, and Culture, right? But this revision has been postponed several times, and so now it's taking place this year. And so like it is happening, we're going to do that. But for the past semesters, we had to pivot our strategy. So we cannot only like sit down and wait for the revision to take place for us to act, but like we decided that there were a lot of other things that we could do, other places and spaces where to present this research. And so like we had to come up with these other ideas on how to advocate and how to use this research and all this information. And like this roundtable and many of other projects that RTE and the Sciences Clinic have are an example of all that, of how to, even if we have these external constraints, we can still advocate for the right to education in other spaces.
Definitely. Thank you, Letty. Hélène, you touched upon some prejudices and biases that you faced in New Zealand, and also the adult centrism, the fact that as students we are seen as just students. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about other biases or challenges that you faced.
Yeah, absolutely, Alice. First, one of the elements that I'd like to talk about, which may be a little bit controversial, is I'd say as students, adult centrism may not necessarily be the first thing that we encounter, and may not be as much of the focus as an issue. I know I sound crazy, bear with me. I've been in meetings where we've had student association leaders who are in their 60s, because our student movement in my country ranges a variety of ages, who have been as politically discredited by 40-year-old higher education managers as the 20-year-olds in the room, despite their life experience. From the perspective of the student movement, students are any age or stage in life, from the child in preschool all the way through to the 65-year-old who's decided to return to university to do their PhD. And from the Indigenous and communitarian perspective of my region as well, we do actually reject the binary of a sort of adult versus youth model, which is kind of seen as a largely Western construct. We see all stages of life as important to the community, which then combats any types of biases in those spaces, from like the pepe, the baby, to the tamariki, the child, to the rangatahi, the youth, to the matua, the parents and the grandparents, to the tipuna, who are the ancestors. And the idea of adult centrism, I really do believe, and these other forms of biases that come with that, have been employed to sort of create a binary that challenges the sort of legislative reality that most nations encounter, that you are a legal adult past the age of 18. Yet in practice, we only see something like 6% of parliaments of the world having politicians below the age of 35. So clearly this binary is being kind of used to minimize political access for students in governmental settings and sort of increase paternalism within the classroom or the lecture hall context. The real challenge to our advocacy goals, I think, is actually ageism. This presumption that younger or older members of our society are somehow more vulnerable or less able to comprehend social and political issues due to apparent cognitive and physical impairments from those who are making these judgments. Student associations have argued for many years in the sort of context of higher education that there is like, this bias basically creates an inherent power imbalance with the lecturer being curriculum creator, assessor, and guarantor of academic freedom all rolled into one. A little bit of a conflict of interest, but you know what I mean. In the managerial or governmental sense, it can be sort of like the taking of political issues away from students through the, oh, you are dissenting or you are vulnerable argument. I recently attended a regional conversation by universities' managerial staff on institutions' management of emissions, who claimed that the use of climate bonds, which is increased debt to minimize emissions on campus, was a way of addressing student distress at the climate crisis that, quote unquote, takes the burden off of students, although they had not specified what distress students were facing about the climate crisis specifically, how they had addressed it, or if they'd even consulted students in the first place. And we see this, unfortunately, quite a lot. When advocating for equal access to higher education, we recognize that there is a myriad of these types of biases I've witnessed and encountered in my space, and know many of my colleagues have encountered this: ageism, racism, sexism, classism, ableism as well. And it creates these sort of barriers because the higher education system sometimes reflects and recreates our imperfect societies, unfortunately. To deal with this, I always tell incoming student leaders, we respect our elders because they have walked before us, but that does not mean we have to agree with them. We push for democratic conversations, focusing on, as Hector said a little bit earlier, citizenship regardless of age, regardless of where you are at in your life. Citizenship is key. We also advocate against sort of the political economy of youth, which is where that binary has capitalized off of young people in education by targeting their age or their gender or sexuality, their ethnicity, or even the type of activism that they do through consumerism. So we put the focus on agency in the classroom or lecture hall by addressing issues or the sort of performativity of education due to these biases that is led by largely neoliberalism, whether it be rote testing or forced behavior in classrooms or value systems, or even more politically contentious issues like Larissa has talked about. We basically oppose an education where students are socialized to particular views because of these biases, by advocating that like all parts of education should include intergenerational co-creation or co-construction. And co-creation is not just consultation in order to try and combat these biases. You don't just bring someone who is from a vulnerable community or a less representative community into the room and say, hey, what do you think of that? You actually need to create a conducive environment to those people feeling safe in those spaces. And also to respect the democratic structures and the structures that students create themselves, inviting them into like engagement in curricula, educational governments, and sort of like all those relevant areas, those social issues that they will be encountering that challenge inherent biases that exist, whether they be like locally, nationally, regionally, or globally. So there's a number of dynamics at play in that, but all of those are key, and to have sort of a liberating right to education in this space, I believe.
Thank you so much, Helen. Faye, is there any questions in the chat that maybe we can have a little bit of time to ask the speakers?
Yes, there's actually one question Chiara raised. It's for Larissa. It's also connected to the link Delphine just shared in the chat. Just to highlight that already, I'm going to let Larissa answer the question after. But I'm sure you will also find interesting information in the report that was submitted to UNESCO. But Larissa, Chiara wants to know if you could present us some academically relevant results about inequality impact on the access to education.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Chiara, for your interest. And well, as Phil already said, in these specific links that Delphine shared with us, you can find like all the academic, because you put like you were very specific on saying like academically relevant. So if you want to know like the sources and all the data, like where we get the data and all that, you can look directly to those links. But of course, that I can give you a sneak peek on some of the statistics and information in general that we found. So as we said, we have concentrated our focus on the geographical inequalities, and in France, most of the higher education institutions, so specifically 1/3 of the institutions are located in Paris, and also a big percentage in Lyon. And so, well, that makes geographic inequalities in the sense that if you live in other parts of France, yeah, you have a higher probability of going to a better quality institution if one of your parents is located in Paris or in Lyon, or if you yourself you live there. Of course, that you can move to those specific cities, but of course that brings costs like that are very high in terms of the rent that you have to pay, the food that you have to buy, and all that. So that like here we see an example of how geographical but also socioeconomic inequalities intersect. Yeah, because like these people, they have to move to other cities, and then they have like their living costs increase. And also just to give you some other statistics that we have found, and not only RTE, but also their partners, because RTE makes partnerships with other academics and other institutions. They have to do with, for example, the state investment. And so the enrollment in higher education in France has increased in the last 5 to 6 years around 10.2%, and the state investment or the state's budget directed to higher education has only increased 1.2%. I'm sorry, just like my French is mixing here, like 1.2% increase in budget. So you see the difference between 10.2 and 1.2. And well, that means that the state is not investing as much money as it should do in order to maintain the same quality of education. And also just like another quick statistic is that around 35% of those whose parents are in the bottom income quintile or have been students compared to so like if you see like the quintiles in which the population is divided, those that are in the bottom quintile, only 35% of those students or those young people are in higher education, compared to 90% of the people who are in the top decile. So that shows that whether, like, depending on your parents' income, there's a higher probability of you attending higher education. And so, well, that shows socioeconomical inequalities in the education in France. But of course, if you want to know like more precise data, you can always consult these links, and we'll be happy to answer any question about any other information.
Thank you so much, Betty. Please do not hesitate to keep asking questions in the chat. We will always have a little bit of time to answer them. And as we move forward, I would like to ask this question to Hector. You already talked a little bit about capacity building, and I would like to know how can we all grow this movement and get momentum, engage more students and stakeholders in the cause to equal access to higher education? What will be your strategy?
Thank you. There will be a little bit of overlap with what I already mentioned, but I feel like the most important thing from the student sector for many years has been raising awareness first. Like you need to raise awareness about the real reasons for inequality. Like I was saying, what are the structural issues that you need to fight back when talking about access to education. And then once you have that awareness, people will probably do that. That's what you need to motivate them. It's when it comes to activism and advocacy, usually what you're asking people is for their time, for them to engage in something. And a lot of people don't realize how much of a big ask that is. Like, for example, if someone comes with you to you with a tablet and just ask you to donate $5, a lot of people think, oh, that's money. Another person asks you like, do you want to join a meeting and come and join this protest? But it's actually time that is way more valuable, and people often ignore that fact. And when you're engaging with volunteers and doing advocacy campaigns, it's usually a lot of time that people need to invest in this. So unless you are able to raise that awareness and motivate people to engage in that fight for change, it will be very hard for you to achieve something. Because what you need to do is you raise that awareness, you have that motivation, and then going back to what I also already mentioned, you need to channel it into political action. That's when we're talking about education in today's world. That's something that is being decided by government. It is political changes. We can't shy away from that reality. When we want to improve access to education, when we want to change our educational system, that will require political action from the people advocating for that change. And a big important part when you're doing this political advocacy is that you need to have it rooted somewhere. Like you need to have a backing, and that's where this unique characteristic of student unions come in. It's the fact that they are democratic, they are representative. So if you are in a movement or in an organization that has democratic procedures where you can really have your voice heard and where people can really participate and have themselves represented by someone in these other rooms, then it will usually lead to bigger movements. People will want to be part of these kind of places where they can really kind of see an effect of their time, the time they're investing. If they are really, if you have those democratic procedures and they can participate, they'll see effects, and that kind of create a virtual circle where you will want to do more because then you see that your actions are having an impact. And using all of this, kind of the raising awareness, pushing for political change, and doing that through democratic and participative organizations is connects back to what I was mentioning with youth spots. It's because if you get these people that have that awareness and that have structured connection with grassroots movements and understand the issues that people that are not accessing education are really experiencing it, if you put that representative then in the decision-making table, you can trust them and they'll be the ones kind of pushing forward for those changes. And I feel like that's a good combination to grow a movement, because then you'll have good feedback. These people will report back. The people in the ground level will see the benefits of the political changes. They'll have better access to education, and then they'll bring it forward. Then they'll also be engaged, bring a new person. Maybe that person that was benefited at a point will then be the representative, and you keep the circle of change. So you need to use this. You need to use democratic participation, organize yourself, and engage in that advocacy in order to grow a movement. If not, you'll just have individuals talking about things that they really have no knowledge about and that they can't see the impact in real life for those that really need it. Yeah, so that's kind of, it's a lot of recipes, but that will be the recipe I recommend for growing a movement.
Thank you so much, Hector. That was so inspiring. And one follow-up question on that. As you said, time is the most valuable asset. And in growing that movement, the more people we engage with, the better. And with your specific topic, which is tax justice, I would like to know, how do you deal when you face resistance from other people, especially with the fact that tax justice is highly political and it's a specific economic and political structure that we try to change. So what do you do?
Yeah, I think one issue is that it's political. The other issue just being completely honest here, is that it's a boring topic. Like no one will be excited to join a 1-hour session on talking about the better tax systems. That's a reality that we have faced as well when we try to do these trainings. So we need to be clear about kind of what we're doing and how we engage the people. But when it comes to this, like the resistance that you're facing, I think something that I've really seen the impact it has is when you know, I can talk here about tax justice and economic or educational opportunities for people from not so privileged backgrounds and stuff, but it will never have the same impact if instead I use my organization, my expertise, and the structures I have to bring someone from there to be the one telling their own story. And that's usually what works when you face this kind of resistance. If you open, like if you're already there and you assume the role of opening the window and the room and the doors for those that are actually feeling the impact and are being neglected their opportunities, it's way harder. Like at least that's my experience for these people that will resist change. They also resist it because they're very disconnected from those realities. But if you bring those people to the same room and they tell their own story and you empower their own voice, they already know what they need, and they're usually like they have all the tools and the understanding of the changes, but they are not being given the opportunity to come in those discussions. And if you give them that opportunity, oftentimes what I've seen is that those people that resist change, they don't dare to resist change in face to face to these people. So that would be kind of it applies to many situations. For example, when you talk about refugee education, and you have universities that they'll try to balance, you know, kind of the quality aspect and then inclusion of refugees, and how do you balance that? Or tax justice, okay, benefits from private companies versus investing in education to and focusing on minority groups. There'll be that resistance, but bring someone from the refugee background or bring someone that will be a direct beneficiary from that investment, sit it down in that table and have them tell no to those changes and have them try to explain why it's not a good investment or why it's not a good change in policy. Often they won't be able to do it. So that will be my recommendation on that.
And that's a very good one. Thank you. So beware who you chose as a spokesperson. Okay, well noted. Hélène, now maybe you can talk a little bit about capitalizing on success. What do you think is the most important thing to do once you reach an objective to keep moving towards more equal access to higher education?
Thanks for this question. I think it's very interesting. Yeah, I think one of the things we always realize within the student movement is that while we're aiming for, you know, equal access in higher education, that's the first like component of activism. That's just the doorway to gaining more access to combat these biases that are being discussed in these spaces. For example, it's like what Hector is saying in that context of bring the person from the community to that space so that you can build that community into that space permanently, not just temporarily. This is because I think one of the elements that why we're so attached to democracy in this space, one of my favorite critical education theorists, Henry and Giroux, states that the beauty of democracy for students is that the objective, even when it is achieved, is meant to be readdressed because the project of democracy is never complete, which is why we continue in that space. It can be viewed as a negative way if you're looking at it from a sort of adversarial perspective between, say, student unions or institutions. But alternatively, if done through partnership, which is really what's being suggested here, there's that possibility for addressing what equality means in varying contexts at varying times with various people in their learning encounters, which is why that project of democracy is so essential when we are looking to achieve an objective. From the student movement perspective, we have a lot of objectives that we aim for. I mean, equal access to higher education kind of encapsulates a lot of them. But like when you look at the diversity of them, there's so many. I mean, at the local level, an objective might be fighting against hidden costs or hardship issues on campus. At the national level, we might have the transformation of educational financing, as Hector's already talked about, or the reform of like oppressive legislation. At the regional level, it might be, you know, mobility of students to be able to engage in higher education. I think Larissa already talked a little bit about that in her own experience, or quality education policy, what that looks like, or even at the global level, you know, the ability to contribute, as you've already contributed in this space at SciencePo and the Right to Education Institution, is to like be able to have those conversations and contribute to international conventions at that global level. So I think a lot of this requires actually recognizing while we are trying to achieve our objective, like what goes into that space of achieving an objective, which is, from our perspective, the student movement is like largely underfunded and politically repressed in certain areas. So objectives are like simultaneously aspirational, as in upholding like education as a public good, but also have to be attainable, such as specific policy reforms. And then the achieving of this objective then signals better relationship building or concessions from political figures, often to civil society, who we largely work with. And this is the triumph for civil society's ability to contribute to that ongoing project of democracy through like intergenerationalism and public accountability in particular, which is why Hector's saying, you know, like, you don't just want someone who will sign up for something in the sense of like, they'll sign away $5 a week. No, you actually want to have a movement, a social movement in the face of pretty much the erosion of many of our traditional democratic institutions. But the main way to get to the real point of this question that you've asked me in the first place, because I love to talk around the subject, that we capitalize off of these wins, is to employ these relationships and networks to build our policy asks and advocacy into the higher education institutions. Sometimes that means that we actually like use the systems and strategies that oppose us to actually try and create more of that conversation, whether it's bringing someone into the room, whether it's occupying a space physically, psychologically, building into our relationships and our networks, which is what we are strongest in, to aid our public facing and legitimize our work as civil society actors for equal access to education. Partly, I think that's because like we're looking at the original intention of what higher education was set up to do. We've been promised that ability to have a community of scholars, thinkers, practitioners that belongs to the people. And we capitalize off the creation, not just of then a like student movement, but a student culture that states we are here to stay because we care about education, because we care about our family, our community, and our nation's futures. So basically, it's like the ability to start a belief system and a belief structure rather than it just like focusing on an objective. And that, you know, equal access to education is not singularly dependent on student participation. It's not just about being in the room, but belonging to the community of education. And I think when we belong to the community of education, that's when we see democracy actually shine in that space.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Ellen. And I guess that having this belief system and, as you say, like this deep motivation is what helps you face maybe when you in the end couldn't achieve some objectives in higher education. And tell me if I'm wrong, but it looks like it's also the key to have this resilience and to keep going in that fight, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think when we think about education, there's always that question, are we doing education for, you know, skill sets? Yes, we are. But we're also doing education for life. That's why we're here. That's why all of us are here. We do it for life because it gives us freedom within ourselves as well as externally. So I think when we're looking at that sort of win-based structure, while it's good to have those objectives and those are the things that we measure our success by, you know, how many students can we get in a room, how many young people can we get talking to policymakers, how much attention can we bring to a movement when we're doing protests on the streets and things like that. I think the underlying element of that is creating an identity, because that's what education was meant to represent. It was meant to give you a sense of fulfillment in your identity. You can clearly see that I'm a critical education theorist within this space. You know, we want to give you your freedom from education. That's the focus of it being a public good. So it's about returning to the essence of what education is, because I don't think at any point anyone in education who is engaged in sort of that vocational side will be like, right, we have enough equal access to higher education, we're now going to stop. No, that's not going to happen, because it's always, you know, just the ability to build a community in those spaces, I think, is essential when we are engaging and capitalizing on what equal access actually means in higher education. It's a community.
Thank you so much, Ellen. let's move on. Larissa, please, could you answer the same question on capitalizing on success?
Sure. Well, just as Ellen was saying, like we have this very ambitious and broad goal about higher education. So like access to higher education quality.
Oh,
Larissa, you muted yourself.
I'm sorry, I was speaking and my mic was off. I'm sorry. So, well, as Ellen was saying, we have this very ambitious goal around higher education. So it's not only about accessibility, but also adaptability, and if it's of quality, etc. So yeah, usually it's very weird that we make something and suddenly we have reached this goal, because as I said, it was, and also as Ellen was mentioning, it's very ambitious and there's always something else to do. So yeah, for sure, we always have to think about how little successes, how can we use those little successes to actually reach our like bigger goal. And well, I think that the example, the Sciences Clinic, is a very good example, because as we said at the beginning, it is an ongoing project that started 5 years ago. So every year, the success or the objective reached by some of the students, that was like the basis of the following group of students. So like they had to capitalize on that success to keep building on those successes to reach the final goal. So, well, to be more precise, once that, for example, that the initial research was done, it's not only about publishing that research. Then you have to think about like to whom to direct that research, like where to publish it, in what forums can we find, so that people actually know that this is an issue in France. And so, well, like you always have to think to what other stakeholders can we get engaged, so that this information reaches the right people. And so, and afterwards, for example, in this year that there has been the research, there has been the advocacy with certain stakeholders, we're still thinking about what to do next. And in this case, it's making this project like live forever and leave it in hands of students all over the world. Because just as in France, in any other country, there are issues concerning inequality, discrimination, and of course that in even bigger extent. So right now, what we're thinking about is like sharing all this with you and with other student unions and with other advocates or activists that advocate for the right to higher education, so that this does not only state it on paper, or that it is not only part of a formal institutionalized review in a committee of the UN, but also that other students can take this into their hands, and that they have more tools to advocate for their rights. And also, for example, when we have presented this information to the UNESCO, or when we have the review of the UN Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in September, it is not like, okay, we already presented this information to the committee, so well, that's done. It's not about that, but like, how can you use that to once again capitalize on that success? So usually when you hear an institution or a body, a treaty body, or whatever that is part of the UN that catches the attention of other stakeholders, of other students, of authorities. So the idea is to use this to say like to make pressure to authorities, because at the end, the state and local authorities are the ones who are going to grant and protect and fulfill and promote the right of higher education. So the idea of presenting this to the UN and to making like all this momentum is to make pressure on the authorities. So like that's a way to capitalize on success. Like, okay, we went to this committee, we went to this treaty body, but you have to know people that you did that. You have to expand that information through social media or to roundtables, etc., so that you can capitalize on that success to make pressure and to expand the movement. So it's all like always thinking about like what's the next action, what's the next step, like how can you use this in order to reach the final and ambitious goal.
Great, thank you so much. I think it's something that we all have to keep in mind, even for our personal lives. Maybe we can have some questions if they are in the chat or from the audience. Please feel free to ask questions.
At the moment, there's no questions, but of course, anytime you can send them here, and I can raise them also in between.
Okay.
Maybe we we can go ahead, and if something comes up, I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you so much, Faye. So all of our speakers have presented their own way of advocating for equal access to higher education, and we saw that in the end they can all be interconnected, right? So maybe we can have a little chat, because it seems that we still have time, on how we could. Oh, Ana Luisa, you have a question?
Yes, of course, but I'll let you finish, and then I'll ask my question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so the question I was about to ask is, how can we all collaborate together moving forward after this roundtable? How GSF, RTE, all of the students from all over the world could still come together and keep on collaborating. How do you think this could be achieved? Victor, do you have an idea?
That's a big question, but I would say the first thing is to get engaged through an organization, like I mentioned, and it can be very different, of course. Coming from an organization representing student unions, I would say go and talk with your local union. You probably have one in your study program in your university, but it can also be other kind of organizations. You know, you all are part of the clinic as well, but it's usually, these are big issues, right? When we're talking about access to education, it makes sense for me to try and build these alliances. Now GSF has done this first collaboration, so I think what is important is to keep the contact, keep informing each other of initiatives that could be relevant, because that's what's needed. We need to support each other, and it's usually better when you do it through some kind of organization or a group that you belong to. So communication flow, inviting each other, I think could be.
Right. Ellen, Larry, do you have something to add on this?
Yeah, sure. So, well, I think that, like already being here and knowing on what topics is the other organization or the other student working, like that's how we build the network. So next time that we have another project, next time that we have another issue, we know like we can reach these people, we can use this forum, and that is a way that we can all collaborate. And also the fact that a very international collaboration, I think that's important, because we as students, I think that we have to bear in mind always that we can have a context and there are different contexts all over the world, but at the end we have a same goal. So we can always rely on other students that are experiencing something else to have a different perspective, and so that we can incorporate that other perspective and adapt it to our own reality. And so I guess that keeping this context and keeping in mind what other peoples are creating and their like use that to build on our movement and our goals, I think that's the way that we can move forward.
Definitely. Thank you. Ellen?
Yeah, I think a lot of the recommendations here are fantastic. And I mean, I would be crazy to talk about networks and relationship building and then not add more to that context. I agree that the fact that people are already here talking about that subject is incredibly important. But I also think it's that ability to remain porous as networks, to being open to meeting new activists from different spaces, talking to people from different contexts. I think all of that builds into the conversations that we need to have on education, because education is the great equalizer in this space. We talk about equal access, but it is the equalizer because it gives everyone that freedom to be able to pursue what they wish to in these spaces. So I think it's, as Hector is saying, whether it's at the local level, going and finding a group or a community that you can work with at your local level, whether it be your student association or student union on campus, whether it be, talking to other academics or talking to students who I think it's just having your community of practice that you can actually talk to about the realities what you are facing, particularly if you're those within a vulnerable community community or group. I think that's really essential, because when we come together as a collective, I think it's a little bit stronger than if we come as individuals. And when it's like stepping into the sort of regional or national spaces, you know, it's sharing our ideas, sharing our cultural experiences and our social experiences in those spaces, and actually getting to know how many players there are in the education space, because education also seems to attract, you know, supranational organizations. We see private actors, as Hector was talking about, coming into that space. Civil society is already there and has been there for many, many years, because it's like filling the gaps where the state has not really aided in certain spaces. So I think that the element going forward is, yeah, just keeping people in that space, knowing who your allies are, being able to build those networks, I think is essential. And I think the fact that we are already able to do that is testament to the fact that it does genuinely work when we come together as a group of people across the world. So yeah.
Thank you so much for those very encouraging words, Ellen, as always. Maybe Anna, you can ask your question now.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for all of your participation here. I arrived a little bit late, so I apologize for that. So I don't know if you already talked about this, but I had a question, and it comes with what Ellen said a few minutes ago about education being about real life issues. And well, in high education is when, like university is when young people are actually getting to adulthood for the first time, many gain their independence. And of course, we all as students know that we learn how to research, have some knowledge. But my question is, do you feel like university has some blank in terms of know-how of practices that could be useful for real life issues, such as really, I don't know, ecological impact? Because student life is also about not only the courses, but sometimes associations. When you get to know people, you get to build your own projects. And if yes, which matter do you think is lacking the most in universities, so then they can teach their students how to really act on a daily basis? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if we can jump, or if Yelisa, you Julian as a word.
No. I was just going to ask Anna if she can precise if that question is only directed to Ellen or all the speakers.
No, all speakers, all of those who want to give an opinion on that.
Okay, great. Well, Lottie, you were starting to talk, so go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, Anna, for your, well, I don't know if you prefer to be called Anna or Luisa, but well, thank you for your question. And yes, definitely, I think that there is a gap, although it depends a lot on the university, but I definitely think that there is a gap on like theory, that the theory that is given on the practical knowledge and skills, mostly skills that are given in university. And in all of cases, that's like a direct problem for students, because they cannot really translate their knowledge into practical skills that they can use in jobs, like to get jobs. And actually, like there are some universities, for example, like to give a very personal example, in Sciences Po, that it's a grande école in France. So it is a very an institution that gives where the education is of high quality. We have a lot of other workshops and things that actually give us other more practical skills that have to do with networking and with project management and with a lot of things that are not only theory, but many other skills that actually help us to gain jobs and have more like access to certain institutions. And of course, that if you're not part of these universities, then there's a huge gap between the education that we receive and the education that other students receive. And well, that is concerning like practical skills, professional skills, and jobs, but also like, for example, concerning your question on climate change and these kind of issues. Yeah, like raising awareness about social problems and environmental problems, and in general like social problems. I think that that's already also a big gap in universities. And going back to my experience in Mexico, I studied international relations, so I was in the Faculty of Social Sciences. So we had a lot of courses that were very critical on a lot of things. So we had these spaces where we could question the government, where we could question the institutions, where we could question social stereotypes, gender, racism, and a lot of things. And I feel that that gives you a very critical mindset, and that opens you the eyes, like to have different perspectives on the problems that we have. So like you can start being more aware of how your individual actions contribute to climate change, to the climate crisis, and also how big companies and like the capitalist system contributes to that. So like you start doing things and you start like doing local projects that can like tackle these global problems. But not all universities are like that. And I was in a social science faculty, but I don't know if people in the science faculty or like in the business administration faculty, if they were having the same kind of knowledge and kind of critical spaces. So yeah, for sure that I think that there is a huge gap between like theory and like practical things and like developing a critical mindset. And yeah, like that prevents a lot of students to actually have all these skills that will help them like to improve themselves individually. And yeah, that at the end, like that has to do with your personal development, that it's very, very important, just as important, or in most cases even more important than theoretical knowledge. Because if you don't have those critical knowledge and even like socio-emotional intelligence, then you will not be able to use all that knowledge in practical things and to improve your personal life, but also the collective life of the people around you.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Larry. Hélène, Hector, do you have something to add for the question, for the Anna's
I can
question?
make a quick comment just on this connection, going back when I mentioned that we need to see education in the context of democracy and citizenship. But that's another factor. It's not only about the skills and job, but also like how when you look at activism, for example, and people that engage with societal change, it's usually in universities where they start with their activism and then they get engaged with other things. And I think there it's not so much about the curriculum, but it's actually about how universities continue to fail in some cases to see student activism and student mobilization as an integral part of higher education. Like it's bound to happen. Like when you have a university which role is to promote critical thinking and to challenge the truths that we consider truths today, it's the perfect mix. And then you have the young people going there and trying to find this new knowledge, and you give them, they're critical to what's happening around them. So kind of for me, when they ask me like what's the disconnection between education and then what's happening afterwards, or what the student does, is that failure to understand that education and the university space is really promoting critical thinking, and activism should be seen as kind of a good sign of a working university. If you have activism, if you have people engaging with their outer societies, that's a good sign that your university is fulfilling their role. If you don't do that, but you have maybe a lot of people going into very technical jobs, I would say that that's not the measurement that you should, the standard that universities should be held to. Yeah, so I would go with that other kind of angle instead.
Very interesting. Thank you, Hector. Hélène?
Yeah, I do have a point to add. Anna, that's a really interesting topic that you brought up. I've actually just come off the back of writing a specific paper on it regarding, can we actually allow students to live their lives in a way that it corresponds with the way that like lectures are taught, particularly in university settings. I really like the work of an academic called Bruce McFarlane, who wrote Freedom to Learn, which really looks at the element of when a student is in the classroom, can we get, or lecture, can we get away from the type of behavioral elements where they're like just forced to move towards assessment and instead move towards, you know, the actual understanding what academic freedom is meant to be through the university structure. I mean, if you go back and look at the 1997 UNESCO statements on academic freedom, it is something that can also be applied to students in that context. And one of the elements is to actually include their lived reality and their lived experience and exploration for that. That was the underlying principle of the student engagement and academic freedom, which is meant to complement the staff engagement and academic freedom to explore through research research topics of relevance to their subject. One of the things that we notice a lot when we're on the ground in these spaces is that, you know, it kind of goes back to what Hector was saying. You know, there's a lot of holes, it seems, within the university structure when it comes to understanding the sort of practicalities of democracy, understanding like the immediate impact of things like climate, which you were bringing up, understanding, we were talking recently at my national level, we don't even get 18-year-olds given like how to budget properly. So they come into their university experience and they end up with massive amounts of student debt because we have a privatized structure in the way that we fund education, and the state pays for that, but then that goes around with them for the rest of their life because university did not provide them that knowledge to actually understand what it is to be an economic citizen as much as anything else. So I think one of the things we probably need to look at when we're talking and addressing the element of equal access to higher education is higher education actually facilitating conversations of equal access on issues and topics of relevance to its students? I know when I did my bachelor's, we had a lecturer who was fascinated by this thing called the internet, and all of the students at the time were already using the internet because it was accessible to them. So like the inability to actually have it ingrained into a student's life experience, you know, then we've just got a theory that's independent of what a student needs. And we've got lots of social issues and topics that students should be engaging with. We've got a big conversation as well going on about how do we have like respect for Mātauranga Māori, which is the Indigenous structure of education, which is very connected to, you know, the way I work in community, the way I connect with my whānau or my family. How do we put that into our educational components so that we're not disconnected from, you know, the reality of the lives of our students? And I think that's really something that students are calling for when they are like protesting for climate change across the world. You know, when they are protesting, you know, the different social issues, whether it be, I know that Hector was saying that tax justice is not super popular, but we saw what Occupy it can be. It can be popular. And I guess it's just understanding how does it impact my world, not in an individualistic sense, but it's like a student's individual situation is related to the global context, is related to the national context. And I think we just don't bring that enough into the lecture hall. And the more we can advocate for that under academic freedom, I think the more we will see students actually flourish in that space.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Once again, great words. So I think we do not have any more questions in the chat. Do we? No? Okay. Then maybe it's time for our speakers to say a final words of conclusion. Please, if there's any things that you wanted to mention but you didn't have time, this is the right moment. Larissa, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So, well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this, although I was also part of the team who organized it. But thank you so much for bringing this space so that we can all get to know the amazing work that other students all over the world are making. And just, well, to keep in mind that like if you have a cause that you're defending as a student, well, you're never alone. There's always all over the world other students that in a formal, institutionalized, or in an informal, very practical way, they have the same concerns. They might be advocating for it, and for sure they're advocating for it because students and youth are very active in general. We like the good thing about the young is that you don't have practical constraints, and in the sense that you, when you envision a change, you can go like all the way, like you really have a very ambitious goal, and we're very passionate about what we do. So for sure there will be a student organization or someone that is working on the same things that you are doing. And so like never hesitate to reach out to all other students for you, like to bring your cause, like to make your cause grow and to reach those goals. And also remember that even here in France, for example, that it's like a country of the global north, that it's in Europe, etc., there is a global south in all global north. So there will always be unfortunately, and we hope that that ends someday. But of like today, there are always marginalized communities in terms of gender, in terms of racialization, in terms of socioeconomic inequalities, etc., that are not being granted the right to higher education or the right to education in general. So there is always some more actions to take, and even if you have the privilege of having those rights promoted, fulfilled, and respected, like we should always be aware that there might be some social problem or some systemic problem that is impeding or preventing other people from accessing those rights. And so never hesitate to keep working on that and take advantage of all the tools that we've shared here, of all the advice, of all the strategies. And we will love to know more about like what other students are doing. So if you're part of the audience and you are also advocating for all these things, we would love to know more about what to do and to keep building this movement and to keep strengthening each other. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I think there's actually a question from Mehdi. If you want to ask your question, and maybe Hélène and Hector, you can answer in your final comment.
Hello, everybody. My name is Mehdi. I'm a PhD student here in Italy. So I've got the really, really basic question here. So maybe I'm looking at it in a different point of view, what we are discussing right now, right here. So, I mean, why higher education is that important? Here the education itself is the problem, or the higher education is the problem? Because by higher education, what it comes to my mind is actually specializing people for some job market. Let's say at least for the engineering point of view that I'm studying in. So, why is it that important? At what scale we are going to address this issue of the higher education in European universities, or just addressing the problem of education all around the world? Because it's a political issue. Okay, how many engineers do we need, electrical engineers here in Europe? If you want to address that problem, if you want to absorb more, actually internationalize the universities, European universities, so then it's going to be another problem, political problem. It will be the immigration problem, willingness of people to come into Europe and study here. So I'm not sure that I'm delivering my point of view or not, because if the education is problem, so maybe we need to rethink of that. I mean, in the basis of how to address this issue. At the moment, just for me, for example, we will be discussing about the inclusion or excellence. So why excellence is important, or why inclusion is important for European university? I don't get this point. Can you please just a question for all of you guys here? Thank you.
Thank you, Mehdi, for your question. Hector, do you want to answer?
Yes, I can try. Yeah, so when it comes to higher education, and it's just completely tied to kind of the way of how our societies have developed. So if you see it from the kind of economic point of view, you need the workforce, and we keep on having more and more complex jobs. You mentioned engineering, for example, like you need to keep people fulfilling their higher education in order to keep economic development growing, going forward, and have a competent workforce. And people are better off, right? It's also shown that if you get higher education, then you will have better opportunities. But the other aspect, going back to the kind of democracy and citizen participation, and that's where at least my organization focuses the most with, is the fact that you need higher education in order to enable that critical thinking and that questioning of what's happening in society. And that's not always a given. So it also depends a lot on what kind of higher education you have. a higher education system that is completely controlled by a government that doesn't allow criticism, for example, then it's as if you didn't have higher education there. So it's not only the access or people having the number of thousands are in higher education, but it's thousands are receiving higher education that enables critical thinking and that enables citizens to fully participate in public debate. That's where I would go to why it is important. It's because it gives people the tools to be able to participate in public debate, in politics, advocate for changes, and just push things forward. And when you look throughout history, you'll see that a lot of the movements, for example, when it comes to women's rights or the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the fight for autonomy, university autonomy in Latin America, or the fight against imperialism or foreign intervention in Latin America usually emerges from universities. So for me, that's why higher education is important. It's because it needs to be connected to society. It needs to respond to the societal issues that we are experiencing. And then it is fulfilling their role, then it is important. But if we have higher education or universities that pretend to live in a bubble and completely ignore the societal needs and the unequal structures that we still have around us, then I would say that I would completely be in agreement with your why do we need this? But if we have that ideal higher education of people actually engage in changing society, then I would say that that's why we need it, because we need people to keep on questioning our realities and moving forward. Yes, and I'll leave it there.
So, but do you think that higher education, actually, let's say universities are able to overcome this huge issue of, actually overcome all the issues that we are facing by higher education? We can solve all the problems and
I think they're the best tool we have. It will take time. Some problems are harder to solve than others, but I think that through education and that practice of having critical thinking and questioning things, that is the best way to do it. The opposite, oftentimes, what you will find is so this is viewing education as a dialogue, right? And we're creating new knowledge and we're finding new solutions and criticizing what we know. And usually, the opposite you'll find on the other side is often violence, and it will be then you don't have that dialogue and you just impose your views. So I feel like it's the worth of having a well-functioning educational system, that you can have those dialogues and you can find new solutions. And of course, big challenges like with the climate change and other things, we won't address them immediately through higher education, but it can help us move closer to those solutions.
But don't you think that here isn't that important, that how do we educate people inside our universities? Isn't it more important than what you mentioned? Just because, okay, what we are teaching them. So we cannot say that, okay, once you enter the university, you have a better mindset of actually solving the other issues, other problems of the world. So because you are actually specializing the students in another way. So, I mean, as I told you, I'm just looking at this issue in a different point of view as an engineer, complete engineer, nothing else. Because we here in our universities, at least here in Italy, they don't use transdisciplinary way to educate students. They just specialize you on that topic, you go for it, and after that, you may end up finding a job or not. So another thing back, another step back. So why do I need to come to the higher education if my work is not guaranteed? So that is another problem raising here. It's a huge topic, I understand. Maybe
yes, it is a huge topic.
it's nothing that we can come up with some results, and it needs to be discussed at least 3 meetings, 4 meetings, I don't know. But just raising, just out of curiosity, nothing.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Mehdi, and thank you for raising this issue. And I think it's another issue because our biggest concern here was access to higher education, and your point is more about quality of education, the content in itself.
Actually, basically, it is about education itself. Education
The essence of itself.
Higher education, you know. If we can educate people, for example, how to use internet, for example, very basic. African, for example, in you know, African countries, we introduce the internet. We tell them how to use internet, how to solve your problems with the internet. That's it. That's education we can solve, and afterward they will find their way using social networks, using networking.
That's not exactly what we were talking about when we talked about education.
Yeah, exactly.
But thank you, Mehdi. We will be glad to keep going with that conversation. Maybe you can contact us later so we can build up on that. And I think it's time for us to go back to our panelists for the concluding words. So maybe Hélène, you can take the floor.
Thank you, Alice. Yeah, I think one of the things that this brings attention to is just the essential conversations that we have around education in these spaces, whether it be access, whether it be quality, they all tie into the elements together. And I think, you know, the site of the university as a space that has a lot of contested information, but also an ongoing conversation as to how democracy plays out in the context of, you know, the sort of market values that we see in this space and the impact that that has on vulnerable groups and their accessibility to these spaces, whether that be for a PhD student or whether that be for someone coming in as an undergraduate. So, yeah, I think the important thing that we can round out this conversation from, especially from my perspective, is just the essentialness of the conversations that we continue to have in these spaces concerning accessibility, but also concerning relationship building, networking in these spaces, in order to have that critical conscience of society, you know, the prioritization of academic freedom among students and as much as among staff in this space, to kind of go back to the intention of what higher education was meant to be, you know, an intellectual group of young people who were basically to be able to, you know, aid those conversations on human rights in the context of wider society that may now sometimes reduce a little bit more to a business model, but allows us to actually have a really candid conversation about the future of education in this context, particularly for groups who are less represented. So yeah, I think those are the immediate things that I take from this conversation, and it's been a real pleasure to be able to connect with so many people passionate about this topic.
Thank you so much, Hélène. Hector, if you have some concluding remarks.
No, I think my view on
you
education.
said everything. Thank you so much. Well, it seems that it's time for us to conclude this meeting. So maybe our co-host GSF can add a few words.
Yes, thank you so much. And I don't even know where to start. I think it's been an amazing journey where we have been discussing education in itself, how it relates to outer society, how it affects the individual, how it's about like taxation and decolonizing global finances of education. And I think all of this shows just how important this in conversation is, and also how complex it is. We had several discussions before this where I was concerned is the question access to higher education too wide, because it basically covers everything. Like everything we see of challenges in society will be present in the classroom and the other way around. If you have universities in authoritarian regimes, then the limitations of what you are being allowed to think as a student will be limited. And the struggles of questioning your curriculum in the classroom will also affect like how societies can change, how we tell our stories, and how we relate as people, as organizations, but also across countries. So I think overall, I'm just blown away by the amazing inputs. It's been a pleasure to also take this space to just have a conversation about what we do. And I actually liked that we ended up with the question, why is this even important? And I think it's important to get back to that question once in a while. Why do we actually do this? Why is higher education so important? And why are we so passionate about advocating for it? So thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you for all the questions and for the participants and for you to for this amazing facilitation of managing this huge conversation, but still steering the direction very smoothly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, it's been a pleasure to have this conversation and to exchange with everyone. And I think some key takeaways will be that higher education is a political matter and that we are all concerned. And as students, we are the biggest stakeholders, and that it is in our hands to mobilize, to get engaged, to use our time, which is our biggest value. Thanks, Hector. And also to remember that it's all about what kind of society, what kind of people do we want to be, and building our own democracy in the end. So thank you so much for all of those insights. I'm just going to remind you that everything that has been shared with you will be once again shared. And the roundtable has been recorded. Thank you. And we will build what we call the repertoire of action, which is basically a table where you could find every type of advocacy that we mentioned that you can also use for your own purpose for higher education, please. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for the audience, for your patience and your participation. Thank you, Hector, Hélène, Frédérique. Thank you, Larissa, Meg, Hisham, who's gone, but also Celine and Prisla, who's part of the Sciences Po team. And I wish you all a very good night.